"Forgive me, Dad," I whispered. The moment I collapsed in the foyer of our Upper East Side townhouse, I saw the blood completely drain from my father's body. The vibrant, hopeful girl who had left the house this morning was gone. The crisp, navy blue blazer of my new tailored suit, the one I wore for my very first day in the corporate world, was brutally torn straight down the back. My knees were caked with dirt, my hair was a disheveled mess, and I was only wearing one shoe. This was no accident. It was the unmistakable trace of violence, torn apart by someone's explicit malice. I had no way of knowing then that this shredded piece of fabric would be the curtain raiser to a vicious war about to engulf our family. Breakfast this morning had been so full of smiles. Over a plate of blueberry ricotta pancakes and freshly pressed coffee, our household staple, my blue eyes had sparkled. Wish me luck on my first day in the real world. I had beamed. Dad had sent me off into the warm spring sunshine with a heart swelling with pride. I didn't know it then, but he was secretly wiping a tear and touching the silver locket inside his pocket, offering a silent promise to my late mother. Ever since we lost my mom, Genevieve, to a severe illness 15 years ago, Dad had raised me entirely on his own. I couldn't count the nights I watched him nearly collapse from the exhaustion of balancing high-stakes work, learning to cook meals, and keeping a home. He never wanted me to feel inferior or marginalized just because I didn't have a mother. Driven by that single thought, he clumsily poured double the love into me. He firmly believed that with enough parental love, I would grow up straight and true, and society would eventually embrace me. But no matter how hard a parent grinds their bones to build a fortress of love, the unreasonable malice of the world can smash it to pieces in an instant. I think he realized this cruel reality as he stared at my shivering back in our foyer. "Alara, what on earth happened? Was it a car accident? Did someone attack you?" He rushed over in a panic, pulling my cold shoulders into an embrace. I weakly shook my head. Huge drops of tears fell from my eyes onto the hardwood floor, leaving dark, damp stains. They told me at the firm. My voice was a strained whisper, squeezed from my throat. They said our firm doesn't hire people from broken, single-parent homes. They said my hiring was an administrative error. Told me to pack my things and get out. I could see he couldn't believe his ears. In modern corporate America, where diversity and individual respect are supposed to be loudly championed, did a company actually exist that openly voiced such archaic, elitist discrimination? Behind their glossy corporate mission statements, an old boys club mentality still festered in closed offices, mocking people's upbringings. He later confessed that a wave of intense nausea hit him at the twisted darkness lurking beneath the surface of society. He knew better than anyone how hard I had worked to get into this firm. He had watched me every night, compiling notebooks of industry research, practicing my interview answers, until my voice went hoarse. The despair of having my blood, sweat, and tears completely invalidated for the sole reason of being raised by a single father was unfathomable. "That can't be all. What about your clothes? And those bruises?" He pointed to the torn back of my blazer and my red, swollen wrists. I shrank even smaller. "The director of human resources," he said it in front of everyone. He said someone raised by a single father is fatally lacking in basic pedigree and social grace. He said a bottom feeder like me didn't have the right to sit in the ergonomic chairs of their prestigious Manhattan office. Lost for words, Dad just continued to listen to me in silence. I could almost hear his heart pounding so violently. I thought the anger would burn his throat away. But if he exploded with rage and started shouting right there, he would only frighten me even more in my deeply traumatized state. He clamped his jaw shut, forcefully pushing the fury down to the very pit of his stomach. I know now that his silence was not consent. It was the quiet ritual of sharpening the blade of his counterattack to its absolute limit. And then, when I was crying, trying to gather my things to leave, the senior associates in the department surrounded me. They called me an arrogant brat. Someone grabbed my blazer from behind, yanked me so hard I tripped, and it tore. Everyone just stood there, looking down at me on the floor, laughing out loud. My voice was trembling uncontrollably with terror and humiliation. My one and only hopeful first step as a working adult had been mercilessly trampled in the mud and ridiculed. To him, as a parent, I knew there was no greater unforgivable atrocity. He gently helped me up and sat me on the living room sofa. He brewed a cup of hot chamomile tea and clasped my cold hands firmly in both of his. "Alara, listen to me very carefully. You did absolutely nothing wrong. The ones who are wrong are the despicable cowards who callously trampled on your dignity." He spoke quietly, but with absolute resolve. He reached down and picked up the orientation brochure that had spilled from my fallen bag. Printed in elegant gold foil was the imposing corporate name, Pinnacle Global Holdings. The moment he saw that name, the look in his eyes changed. I couldn't believe it was that company. The general public had no idea, but my father had an unbreakable, deep-rooted history with Pinnacle Global Holdings. He told me to rest, stepped into his home office, and pulled out his smartphone. He dialed a highly classified, direct line number he hadn't called in years. He later told me the line barely rang twice before a panicked voice picked up. "It's me," Dad said. "Bring the CEO of Pinnacle Global Holdings to me right now." He heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. The price for making his pure-hearted daughter shed tears and tearing away her pride would be astronomically high. He decided then to give them a despair profound enough to shake the very foundations of their corporation. His true counterattack began in this exact second. After hanging up, he exhaled quietly. With just one phone call, he had set massive gears beginning to grind and turn. When he returned to the living room, I had cried myself to sleep, curled up into a tight ball on the sofa. Clutching the torn scraps of my blazer to my chest, I looked like a wounded bird caught in a hurricane. He gently stroked my hair, silently promising to make everything right. I learned later that he walked to his master bedroom and pulled a single suit from the deepest recesses of his walk-in closet. It was a bespoke charcoal pinstripe Savile Row suit that he hadn't worn in 15 years. The moment he slipped his arms into the sleeves, his spine naturally straightened, and the air in the room instantly grew taut. It was the moment he discarded the face of an ordinary, gentle father, and the man he used to be awakened. Through the federal transcripts, witness testimonies, and my father's own vivid retelling, I know every detail of the war that unfolded while I slept. He caught a black car and headed for the Pinnacle Global Holdings headquarters in the financial district. He told me the familiar Manhattan cityscape rushing past the windows looked strangely faded to him that day. The larger the corporation, the louder it sings of social contribution and ethics, the more dreadfully corrupt it is on the inside. The sight of companies trying to hide their ugly true nature behind a glittering exterior seemed truly comical to him. As he rode, he closed his eyes, coldly and ruthlessly constructing the sequence of events in his head. In his mind, making me cry was a debt that would never be settled with a half-hearted verbal apology. He believed he needed to fundamentally and completely destroy the cheap pride they valued most. Raising one's voice in a fit of rage is amateurish. To truly terrify an opponent and drive them to the brink of despair, one must dwell in a silence devoid of all emotion. He arrived at the towering glass and steel headquarters. The atrium lobby boasted soaring ceilings, its expensive Italian marble floors reflecting a cold, sterile light. He later noted the irony. In a space polished to such exquisite beauty, only the human hearts were as murky and stagnant as ditch water. Just as he turned toward the reception desk, a vulgar laugh echoed from the back of the lobby. "See? I told you. Some working-class charity case from a broken home has no place in our elite division." The owner of the voice was a stout man in his mid-50s. He walked with his arms crossed, showing off a gaudy luxury watch, trailed by a pack of young junior associates. Dad recognized the faces of those young men. They were the senior associates from the department photo I had proudly shown him this morning. They were nodding repeatedly, wearing sycophantic, sneering smiles to flatter the older man. Without a moment of hesitation, Dad stepped directly into their path. Seeing him, the stout man furrowed his brows, blatant disgust washing over his face. "Who the hell are you? This isn't a place where some filthy outsider can just wander in," Dad stated his name quietly. "I am the father of Alara Vance, the new hire you dismissed this morning for your own irrational reasons. She used her mother's maiden name to build her career on her own merit, a detail your supposedly elite background checks failed to notice." The moment he heard those words, a twisted grin spread across the man's face. "Ah, the single dad of the Vance girl. I'm Merrick Caldwell, director of HR. And what's your business? Don't tell me your little girl came crying to you, and you came to get down on your knees and beg me to rehire her?" The junior associates burst into laughter, the sound echoing obnoxiously across the lobby. Like father, like daughter, huh? No sense of social grace whatsoever. Coming into a top-tier Wall Street firm wearing some outdated, cheap-looking suit. They surrounded Dad in a half-circle, shooting him cold, ruthless glares as if looking at trash on the sidewalk. The faces of people who trample on the weak from a zone of absolute safety are always the same kind of ugly, regardless of age or gender. Dad didn't utter a single word. He just stood there, staring dead into HR Director Caldwell's eyes with a completely expressionless face. Mistaking his lack of a rebuttal for fear, Caldwell's attitude grew even more inflated. Listen closely. A bottom feeder raised by a single father obviously hasn't received a decent upbringing. Defective goods like her don't have the right to cross the threshold of my company. A nobody like you is 100 years too early to be filing complaints with me. Bathing in a shower of humiliating insults, Dad didn't blink once, nor did his expression falter. Irritated by his eerily unbroken silence, Caldwell dramatically waved at the security guards standing near the turnstiles. "Hey, security, throw this trespasser out right now. If he resists, call the NYPD." Heavily built guards approached Dad with grim expressions. The junior associates pulled out their iPhones, starting to film the scene with triumphant smirks. "Get lost. And don't ever show your filthy face in front of me again," Caldwell spat. His face flushed. It was exactly at that moment. "Stop!" The doors of the CEO's private elevator at the far end of the lobby flew open with tremendous force, and a scream that sounded like a dying animal echoed through the atrium. Seeing the owner of the voice, Caldwell and his associates instantly turned pale. "Mr. Sterling, why are you down here?" Julian Sterling, the CEO and top executive of Pinnacle Global Holdings, was sprinting at full speed across the marble lobby, his expensive silk tie flailing, sweating like a waterfall. He shoved the security guards surrounding Dad aside with brute force and slid to a violent halt right in front of him. Then, as Caldwell and the others stared with eyes bulging in disbelief, CEO Sterling's knees completely gave out. He collapsed onto the marble floor, burying his ashen face in his trembling hands, utterly broken before my father. "I am so terribly sorry." "Mr. Chairman!" That single, trembling sentence was dropped like a bomb into the dead silent lobby. "Chairman. Julian, what are you saying? This guy is clearly just some poor smack." A dry, explosive sound snapped sharply across the marble hall. Caldwell's words were violently cut off by a brutal backhand slap from CEO Sterling. Struck with immense force, Caldwell stumbled back several steps, clutching his cheek, looking at his CEO as if he had lost his mind. From the hands of the junior associates who had been filming, iPhones slipped and crashed to the floor one by one. The sound of hard metal hitting the expensive stone sounded exactly like their crumbling pride. "Who the hell do you think you are talking to, you insolent fool?" Sterling's roar vibrated through the cavernous space. "This gentleman is the founder of Pinnacle Global Holdings, and our absolute majority shareholder, Chairman Silas Thorne." The blood vanished from Caldwell's face in a microsecond, leaving it the color of ash. His mouth opened and closed like a fish, but his vocal cords were so paralyzed with terror that he couldn't even manage a whimper. The junior associates looked at each other, their knees knocking together, and collapsed onto the floor. Power is something that becomes cheaper the louder you flaunt it. Truly, terrifying power holds its breath silently in places no one notices. The arrogance they wore as employees of a top-tier firm was nothing more than a fragile illusion, built upon a foundation my father had created with his own blood and sweat. That flimsy scaffolding was now loudly collapsing right beneath their feet. Dad looked down at Sterling, who was still kneeling, and spoke quietly. "Stand up and look at me." At his low, calm voice, the CEO's shoulders twitched, and he stood up with agonizing slowness. His face was covered in a greasy sweat, completely devoid of color. 15 years ago, to keep a promise to my dying mother, and to pour all his time into raising me, Dad had voluntarily stepped down from the front lines of management. He entrusted the future of the company to Julian, his most trusted right-hand man at the time. To protect his peaceful days with his beloved daughter, he walked away from the seat of ultimate power. But for the massive organization he let go of to generate a blade of malice that would return to cut my heart. Could there be a more violent irony? No matter how much a parent cares and tries to live quietly, the malice of the world shows no mercy. 15 years, Dad said. "It has been 15 years since I left this company in your hands, Julian. It's grown into a very impressive building, but it seems the inside has rotted into a vile, festering swamp." At his words, CEO Sterling bowed his head again, looking like he was about to burst into tears. Dad shifted his gaze away from him and turned back to Caldwell, who was still holding his cheek in a daze. When Dad took a step closer, Caldwell scrambled backward like a frightened beast. It's a lie. It has to be. There's no way a man in an outdated suit like that is the legendary founder. Unable to face reality, Caldwell spouted pathetic excuses. He truly believed you could judge elite status solely by appearances. The fact that a man who measured human worth only by the brand tag on a tailored suit sat at the top of human resources was the very fatal pathology infecting this company. Caldwell, was it? I hear you said something to my daughter this morning. That someone raised by a single parent is fatally lacking in basic pedigree and social grace? Dad enunciated every single word, as if branding them into his skin. Caldwell finally collapsed to his knees. That girl. I had no idea she was the chairman's. No, it's a misunderstanding. It was just part of a slightly rigorous stress test to check the resilience of the new hires. A test? Instead of raising his voice, Dad dropped its pitch even lower. He told me later that he learned for the first time in that moment that when human anger crosses its critical threshold, it doesn't explode, it settles into an absolute zero silence, tearing a new employee's suit from behind, causing physical injury, and mocking her family environment in front of a crowd. Is that our company's test now? Julian. Since when did this firm become a third-rate racket that encourages violence and discrimination? The CEO shook his head frantically, his face pale. Dad pulled out his smartphone and tapped the screen a few times. I won't ask you to forgive them. I will make them pay the price for what they did to my daughter, thoroughly and mercilessly, under the rules of society. He pierced Caldwell and his lackeys with an icy stare. Julian. Lock down every entrance and exit in this building, right now. Do not let a single person from the HR department leave. And call the NYPD. I'm pressing charges for assault and destruction of property. Caldwell let out a short, pathetic shriek. At the word police, one of the junior associates looked like he was about to start sobbing. But the hell Dad had prepared didn't end there. He slowly crouched down and whispered directly into Caldwell's ear. Don't think this ends with just my daughter's incident. Caldwell, that little project you've been running behind the scenes for the past few years, abusing your position as HR director, I've already made my move. Caldwell's eyes opened so wide they looked like they might tear, his mouth hanging half open as if he'd forgotten how to breathe. A bottomless despair and terror were clearly etched into his pupils. Now, the real war begins. Caldwell stared at his face, but in the next second, the color of fear suddenly vanished from his face, replaced by an eerie, creeping smile. It was the bizarre expression of a man standing on the edge of a cliff who had just found a spider's thread to cling to. You know about the project? Caldwell chuckled, a wet, repulsive sound. Ha, ha, I see. As expected of the legendary founder, you have sharp ears. Caldwell slowly stood up, brushing the dust off the knees of his suit. The face that had been pale with fear just moments ago had regained a brazen defiance. From the distance, the blaring sirens of NYPD cruisers were approaching. Someone must have made the call, just as Julian ordered. But you know, Chairman Thorne, no matter how much noise you make, it's already too late. The ones who hold the real power in this company are no longer CEO Sterling, nor are they a retired relic like you. It's the new board of executives, including me. Caldwell pulled a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, wiping the sweat from his forehead while glaring sideways at Julian. His gaze held the distinct color of blackmail. Isn't that right, Julian? You know it just as well as I do. If I get hauled off by the cops right now, the numerous connections this company has with illegal vendors and shell companies will be made public. The moment that happens, the firm files for bankruptcy. Your lovely little family will be out on the streets. CEO Sterling's shoulders jerked violently. He looked back and forth between Dad and Caldwell, standing frozen with an expression of sheer agony. Dad quietly observed Julian's profile. He told me later that the young, passionate Julian who had shed blood, sweat, and tears alongside him, armed with nothing but his integrity to build this company, was nowhere to be found. He realized that when a man gains too much to protect and becomes obsessed with status and prestige, it becomes tragically easy for someone to grasp his weaknesses and force him into complicity with evil. Within this beautifully glass-paned building, the ugly self-preservation of human beings swirled like toxic sludge. Dad later expressed a profound sadness at the cruel contrast. Seeing Caldwell's aggressive stance, the junior associates who had been cowering on the floor began to stand up one by one. For their own self-preservation, They chose the path of fawning over the one they believed held the immediate power. That's right. This crazy old man suddenly burst into the lobby and started acting violently. We are completely the victims here. The HR director is right. Letting some broke girl from a broken home join the firm lowers our corporate prestige. We were just giving that arrogant brat a little education to protect the company. They lined up their lies, pointing fingers at my father and sneering. The madness of a mob is terrifying. If one person tells a lie, it eventually morphs into the justice of the entire organization. But the moment they soiled my dignity with their words again, a quiet flame ignited in him, or so he later told me. These men who knew nothing of the nights I spent crying and striving, mocked me with a paper-thin sense of superiority. Dad didn't say a word, just stood silently, absorbing the barrage of their vile insults. They likely mistook his silence for the helplessness of someone who couldn't argue back. Caldwell's laughter echoed even louder across the lobby. Hey, Chairman. Times have changed. You can't survive in business with just pretty ideals and morals anymore. Only those with superior bloodlines and pedigrees stand at the top, and the bottom feeders crawl in the dirt. That is the correct shape of modern Wall Street. Is that really what you all believe? Dad's brief, strained question was met with snorts of derision from the young associates. It seemed not a single drop of human conscience remained in them. This is the ultimate fate of a corrupt organization. Just then, the automatic revolving doors spun, and several NYPD officers rushed into the lobby with grim faces. As if he had been waiting for his cue, Caldwell rushed over to the officers with exaggerated gestures. Officers! Please, arrest this deranged old man immediately. He trespassed into our building and attempted to assault us. I'm pressing charges for attempted battery and destruction of property. Take him away! The junior associates swarmed the officers, pouring malicious lies about Dad into their ears. One of the officers approached him with a hard expression. Between him, wearing a 15-year-old suit, and the executives of a massive corporation draped in modern luxury brands, it was natural that he looked like the crazy intruder. Are you the one causing a disturbance here, sir? I need you to come down to the precinct so we can get your statement. The officer's voice was cold. Caldwell and the associates looked down at Dad with triumphant smiles. They were absolutely certain of their victory. They truly believed that with the fabricated scenario they had just spun, they could permanently eliminate him. Julian covered his face with both hands, unable to do anything but tremble. But Dad didn't run, and he didn't hide. He looked straight into the police officer's eyes and smiled quietly. There was no need to panic. The exact moment your opponent believes they are at the pinnacle of victory and completely drops their guard, that is the most effective timing for a counterattack. I have no problem coming with you, officer. But before we do, I'd like you to listen to this. Mr. Caldwell, earlier this morning, to hide the evidence of your assault on my daughter, you intentionally deleted the security camera footage from the atrium, didn't you? Caldwell snorted. What baseless nonsense. The lack of footage is due to a system glitch. Yes, you erased the video. But there is one thing you forgot to erase. Dad reached into the inner pocket of his suit, slowly pulled out a small, black digital voice recorder, and pressed play. The moment the audio spilled out, the blood entirely drained from Caldwell's face, and the air in the lobby instantly froze solid. What played from the black device was a slightly static-laced, but utterly definitive recording. Did you really think a bottom feeder from a broken home like you could ever work at Pinnacle Global Holdings? You arrogant little bitch. Caldwell's vile voice echoed clearly across the lobby. Then came the sickening, sharp sound of fabric tearing, followed immediately by my own desperate, tearful scream. Please, stop it. Dad later confessed that as he gripped the recorder, his chest felt like it was going to burst with a mix of rage and sorrow. This audio was my own doing. Surrounded by grown men, my body trembling with terror, I had desperately reached into my jacket pocket and pressed the record button on my phone to secure the evidence. He told me he had always thought it was his duty as a parent to protect me from all malice. But the little child he thought he needed to protect was no longer there. I hadn't surrendered to unreasonable violence. I had fought back resolutely, all on my own, to protect my dignity. When he realized that fact, he felt a profound pride in me, and an anger bordering on absolute murderous intent toward Caldwell. Hearing the recording, the police officer's expression instantly hardened. The eyes of suspicion that had been focused on Dad just moments ago pivoted entirely to Caldwell. You said your name was Caldwell? The officer's voice dropped an octave. "Why don't we head to the precinct so you can give us a very detailed explanation about this audio?" It's a fake. It's deepfake AI audio." Caldwell backed away, his face turning beet red. This old man fabricated it to frame me. But to anyone with ears, it was obvious that the raw, visceral audio was the unvarnished truth. Watching Caldwell tell such transparent lies was beyond comical. It was pathetic. We had nothing to do with it. Director Caldwell did it all on his own." "Yeah. We tried to stop him, but he tore her jacket by force." The junior associates who had been flattering him and mocking Dad just seconds ago scattered like spiders, abandoning him entirely. Relationships bound only by profit and self-preservation collapse in an instant when crisis strikes. This is the miserable end for people who only know how to suck up to the strong and beat down the weak. Dad watched their betrayal with cold eyes. Suddenly, the isolated Caldwell began to laugh like a maniac. "Don't screw with me. You're all accomplices. And besides, a recording like this won't hold up as evidence. It's an illegal wiretap. Our company's employment contract has a strict NDA prohibiting unauthorized recording on the premises. That little bitch violated it." He pointed at Dad, veins popping on his forehead, screaming, "I'll sue that girl for breach of confidentiality. I can demand $10 million in damages. I'll plunge you and your daughter into a hell of debt for the rest of your lives." Using the law as a shield to threaten the weak. Ignoring his own crimes to attack the slight vulnerabilities of his opponent. This is the classic tactic of scum like him. But Dad didn't waver a single millimeter at his threat. He just slowly shook his head. $10 million in damages. I see. How terrifying. But Caldwell, you're making one massive miscalculation. Seeing Dad's utterly composed demeanor, Caldwell glared at him, unable to hide his irritation. "My daughter made this recording before the formal onboarding process was completed. She hadn't even signed your precious NDA yet, but even if she had, $10 million in damages? How terrifying. Caldwell, you seem to have forgotten the jurisdiction you operate in. New York is a one-party consent state. She doesn't need your permission to record your abuse, NDA or not. A corporate contract does not supersede state criminal law. It is simply the raw, legal evidence of a vicious assault." Caldwell's face went pale again. Calculating as he was, he instantly understood that Dad's words were legally airtight. But men who cling to power always die hard. Caldwell's bloodshot eyes swept the lobby, locking onto CEO Sterling. "Julian, are you just going to hand me over to the cops? If I get arrested, I'm telling the feds everything about the shadow ledgers, the embezzlement through the dummy corporations, the dealings with organized crime. I'll say it was all on your orders. The company will go bankrupt. Your shiny, perfect life ends today." CEO Sterling let out a short scream and collapsed onto his hands and knees. The police officers suddenly tensed up. What was supposed to be a simple assault case had just violently pivoted into the stench of a massive corporate crime syndicate. "Look at that. If you don't want this company destroyed, throw this old man out right now. Send the cops away. I hold the cards to take this entire empire down with me." Caldwell smiled his twisted smile, convinced of his victory, exposing his own crimes just to threaten the other party, using the corporation as a human shield to guarantee his own safety. To think such hideous bartering was taking place inside this beautiful office building. Dad let out a deep, heavy sigh. "Julian, you truly are a foolish man. You let a cheap thug like this hold the fate of the company for years?" When Dad spoke with pity, Caldwell puffed out his chest triumphantly. "Call me a thug all you want, but look at reality, Chairman Thorne. You lose. If you cut me loose, this company vanishes without a trace. The empire you bet your life to build, gone." Dad stared at the slowly scuffing marble floor, then slowly raised his head. He spoke quietly, but with crystal-clear enunciation so everyone could hear. "Who said I had any intention of leaving such a rotten company intact?" Unable to comprehend the meaning of his words, Caldwell and Sterling both wore blank, idiotic expressions. At that exact second, the automatic doors of the entrance slid open. Dozens of men in dark windbreakers and suits poured into the lobby in perfect, intimidating silence, their heavy footsteps echoing like a drumbeat. Seeing the face of the man walking at the front of the pack, a scream of absolute despair leaked from Caldwell's mouth. The group of men in dark suits deployed across the marble lobby with military precision. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of their presence was so intense that even the NYPD officers instinctively swallowed hard and stepped aside to make way. At the head of the pack walked a tall man with piercing eyes and silver-flecked hair. The moment Caldwell saw him, a pathetic, wheezing sound escaped his throat. "V. Vance? Why the hell is the assistant director of the FBI here?" Caldwell backed up, pointing a trembling finger at the man. The man called Vance didn't even spare Caldwell a glance. He walked straight up to my father, and to the shock of everyone in the room, he bowed deeply. "Chairman Thorne, apologies for the sudden schedule change, but we have deployed our agents exactly as you instructed." At those words, Caldwell, the CEO, and the surrounding associates turned completely to stone. The Department of Justice and the FBI's Financial Crimes Section. This is the ultimate law enforcement apparatus of the state, dedicated to exposing the corruption of politicians and megacorporations. The fact that they were moving meant this was no longer a small-scale HR scandal or a simple assault case. It meant the company itself was being recognized by the federal government as a massive criminal syndicate. The police he thought he called to protect himself had just become the walls of an inescapable cage. Caldwell's face was plastered with a despair that defied comprehension. Dad gave Vance a small nod and turned back to the dumbfounded Caldwell. "Caldwell, that shadow ledger and the embezzlement through dummy corporations you were just bragging about. Did you honestly think I didn't know?" Caldwell's eyes bulged, and he shook his head violently. "Impossible. How could a retired old man know about our top-secret operations? Even after I stepped away from the front lines 15 years ago, I never stopped watching this company as its majority shareholder. And, more importantly, as the founder who loved it like my own child. Numbers never lie. No matter how cleverly you manipulate the books, you cannot deceive the eyes of a man who bled and sweated on the ground floor for decades. Over the last few years, unnatural capital movements and rumors of vicious supplier squeeze tactics had reached my father's ears. He had secretly made contact with Vance, and for over a year, they had been quietly building an airtight case with hard evidence of their fraud. Originally, he was planning to reveal everything at next month's shareholder meeting and completely purge the executive board. But today, when they dared to scar my dignity and tried to steal my future, he lost any reason to let this putrid organization survive for even one more second. You think you can use the company as collateral for your own neck? Don't make me laugh. I will dismantle this filthy corporation with my own two hands. At his cold, merciless declaration, CEO Sterling finally broke down weeping, prostrating himself on the marble floor. "I'm so sorry, Chairman. I only wanted to protect the company's profits." Silence. Dad's low, sharp rebuke sliced through his excuses. 15 years ago, when he entrusted the company to him, Julian's eyes were full of pure hope and a sense of duty, but the sweet poison of power easily paralyzes the human conscience. People start to delude themselves into thinking that stepping on the weak to line their own pockets is justice. Seeing the miserable state his former comrade had fallen into was almost unbearable for Dad. His choice to step away to protect his family had, in the end, allowed this man to run rampant, creating a massive monster that eventually circled back to hurt me. Life is full of such cruel irony. Vance barked sharp orders to his agents. Arrest HR Director Caldwell and CEO Sterling on charges of corporate embezzlement and aggravated breach of trust. Simultaneously begin a comprehensive raid of the executive suites and the HR department. Dozens of federal agents moved at once, throwing the lobby into chaos. There was no escape. Just as everyone accepted that fact, Caldwell, who was still on his knees, began to shake. Then, a manic, high-pitched laugh bounced off the lobby ceiling. "Ah ha ha ha! Brilliant! Truly brilliant, Chairman Thorne. Destroying your own company just to execute justice. It's so beautiful it brings a tear to my eye." Caldwell threw his head back, glaring at Dad with bloodshot eyes. All fear had vanished from his face. Only the demonic obsession of dragging everyone to hell with him remained. "But you know, Chairman, you're coming to hell with me." Dad stared back at his frantic display with an emotionless face. "What nonsense are you spouting now?" "Oh, it's not nonsense. Agent Vance, you and your little squad are tracking the billions in embezzled funds, right? I assume you're currently trying to figure out whose name is on the hidden offshore accounts?" At Caldwell's words, Vance's expression tightened slightly. Seeing that, Caldwell screamed even more triumphantly. "The final destination of the embezzled funds is a shell company account in the Cayman Islands. And the registered owner of that account is Genevieve Thorne. In other words, your beloved wife who died 15 years ago. In that instant, a massive shock ran through my father, as if an icy hand had directly squeezed his heart. His vision swayed, and his breathing grew shallow. Surprised? It's the ultimate insurance policy I spent years setting up for a rainy day just like this. The paperwork is flawless. No matter how you investigate it, the narrative is clear. The mastermind behind the embezzlement, the one hiding the slush funds under his dead wife's name, is none other than you, Chairman Thorne. Caldwell twisted his face and stuck his tongue out like a lizard. Well, Vance? Why don't you arrest the real kingpin standing right in front of you? The air in the lobby stretched to its absolute breaking point. The junior associates and the NYPD officers held their breath, staring intensely at Dad and Vance. To use the pure, untarnished name of my late mother as a human shield for his filthy crimes. The blood boiled in Dad's veins, and his thoughts went entirely white. Vance turned to him slowly, his mouth heavy. How was he supposed to go home and face me now? The blade of justice he had spent a year sharpening was suddenly, unexpectedly, pressed against his own throat. Chairman Thorne, Vance's deep, cold voice echoed in the marble hall. I deeply regret this. But as long as the account is registered in your late wife's name, I must ask you to accompany us for questioning as well. The moment Caldwell heard those words, he looked up at the ceiling and let out a jubilant, roaring laugh, his face bright red. You hear that, Thorne? Starting today, the world will know you as the absolute scum who cannibalized his own company, and your precious Alara will live the rest of her life pointed at and whispered about as the daughter of a master thief. Caldwell laughed so hard he clutched his stomach. The junior associates nearby started whispering among themselves again. The people who had just been cowering in fear were now looking down at my father with cold eyes, treating him as a criminal. When the winds of power shift, human attitudes flip instantly. Inside this beautifully polished building, the bottomless ugliness and fickleness of humanity was being forced down his throat. That's a lie. The chairman would never do that. Caldwell, you orchestrated the whole thing. Suddenly, Julian Sterling, still on his hands and knees, screamed desperately. Perhaps it was the last shred of conscience left in him, trying to protect his former mentor. But Caldwell glared at him with ruthless eyes. Shut up, you incompetent puppet. The evidence is airtight. The signature for opening the Cayman account, the seals on the transfer records. I have flawless documents that will prove they belong to Silas Thorne himself. Even the FBI's forensic labs won't be able to spot the fake. An auditory hallucination of handcuffs clicking echoed in the back of my father's mind. My mom had been a genuinely kind, modest woman who loved growing flowers in our garden. The rage he felt at her pristine name being dragged into the mud of a financial crime could not be put into words. Does malice not rest until it tramples on the dignity of the dead, as well as the living? According to the witnesses, he gritted his teeth and balled his hands into fists, so tight his nails cut into his palms. But if he let his emotions take over and exploded right here, it would play right into Caldwell's hands. He took a deep breath, forcefully cooling the boiling blood in his veins. Turning anger into violence or shouting is what fools do. True vengeance is completed by internally and systematically collapsing the absolute fortress your enemy believes keeps them safe. I have no objection to coming with you, Vance. The law is the law. I will comply. When Dad said that quietly, Caldwell nodded deeply, convinced of his victory. Finally realized, you've lost? Be a good boy and count your past glories in a cold cell, old man. But let me confirm one thing. Dad cut him off, walking slowly toward him, staring straight into the triumphant man's eyes. Caldwell, you said you forged the Cayman account documents perfectly. You mimicked my wife's handwriting and signature flawlessly? Caldwell smirked and shrugged casually. Of course. I had it done at a level that even professional handwriting analysts could never see through. How many years do you think I spent on this? I secretly gathered your wife's old documents and had every single letter traced to absolute perfection. Hearing his supreme confidence, a low chuckle escaped Dad's lips. His laughter, so out of place in this tense situation, caused the smugness to slightly fade from Caldwell's face. What's so funny? Enjoy acting tough while you still can. No, I just couldn't help but laugh at how pathetically, fatally naive your perfection is. Dad took one step forward, and Caldwell instinctively took a half step back. You said it was a perfect forgery, but that assumes your target was a standard, everyday housewife. Caldwell furrowed his brows suspiciously. She was just some ordinary woman. What's your point? Without answering, Dad shifted his gaze to Vance standing behind him. Vance let out a small sigh, nodded, and pulled a weathered leather ID wallet from his breast pocket, thrusting it straight into Caldwell's face. The moment Caldwell saw the gold badge and the lettering inside, his eyeballs nearly popped out of his skull, and his facial muscles began to spasm. Take a good look, Director Caldwell, Vance said, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. Genevieve Thorne's maiden name was Vance. She was my older sister, and before she married Silas, she was a highly decorated federal prosecutor for the DOJ, right here in the Southern District of New York. She spent years taking down corporate financial criminals exactly like you. Time in the lobby stopped entirely. The junior associates' mouths hung open, and Julian looked like he was seeing an alien. Caldwell made a bizarre wheezing sound in his throat, his eyes darting frantically between the badge and Vance. Do you honestly think a former federal prosecutor, who operated on the front lines of tracking illegal slush funds, would ever open a dummy account for money laundering under her own name? Furthermore, before she died, my sister intentionally embedded specific, unique microstrokes into her official signatures to prevent exactly this kind of forgery. A trace job done by amateurs based on surface-level documents? Send it to our lab in Quantico, and they'll prove it's a forgery in less than 3 minutes. Vance's words smashed Caldwell's hopes into fine dust. The insurance policy he thought was perfect was utterly useless from the very beginning. Just a piece of scrap paper. It can't be. That's impossible. Caldwell finally collapsed, falling to all fours on the marble. To abuse the name of a federal prosecutor's sister to hide your crimes. Caldwell, you are going to the deepest, darkest pit of federal prison. Dad looked down at the groveling man. But it wasn't over yet. The true finishing touch, the price for the tears I shed, was about to begin. Before Dad could reach for his phone to make the final call, Caldwell, on his hands and knees, twisted his face into a grotesque, ugly smile. It's useless. Even if the documents are proven fake, the billions I embezzled have already been moved to other offshore accounts. No matter how good the FBI is, they'll never find money that's been run through multiple crypto tumblers and washed that thoroughly. The eyes of a cornered man sometimes reveal a terrifying obsession. Instead of showing remorse for his crimes, he was only thinking of how to slip through the cracks of the law and escape. To think Dad had entrusted the core HR functions of his company to a man so spiritually impoverished, so entirely consumed by his own greed. A fierce regret for his past inability to see his true nature squeezed my father's chest. Caldwell staggered to his feet, screaming like a madman. As long as I have the cash, I can start over anywhere in the world. You're a crazy old fool for calling in the feds just because I roughed up some broke girl from a broken home. You can act all high and mighty and arrest me, but you'll never see a single cent of that money again. Dad didn't open his mouth to respond to his vile provocations. He simply waited in silence for the person on the other end of his earlier calls to arrive in the lobby. Silence is the greatest form of contempt, but Caldwell seemed to mistake his icy stare for a sign of his victory. Wiping the greasy sweat from his brow, he let out a triumphant roar of laughter. Right then, the heavy automatic doors of the entrance slid open. The federal agents securing the perimeter parted silently, allowing a single man to walk briskly into the lobby. He was an older man in a finely tailored gray suit, carrying a thick metal briefcase. The moment Caldwell saw his face, he lit up, rushing toward him like he'd found salvation. Donovan, Chief Financial Officer, you have impeccable timing. The feds are here. You need to get ready to run too. You finished moving all the funds to the untraceable accounts, right? At Caldwell's words, the junior associates and Julian gasped. The fact that the CFO was complicit in the embezzlement meant the rot in this company reached the absolute marrow of its bones. But the man called Donovan didn't even spare Caldwell a glance. He walked straight past him and stopped directly in front of my father. Then, just like Julian had earlier, he bowed deeply with absolute respect. Chairman Thorne, I apologize for the wait. As per your instructions, the entire $500 million that HR Director Caldwell attempted to wire to overseas shell companies has been intercepted and frozen in transit. We have just completed the protocol to return the full amount to Pinnacle Global Holdings' primary corporate accounts. The air in the lobby shattered and froze. Caldwell's face was wiped completely blank, his mouth opening and closing like a dying fish. D. Donovan. What are you talking about? Frozen. We're partners. We've been building this slush fund together for years. Donovan looked down at Caldwell with eyes colder than ice, treating him like garbage on the side of the road. Please do not flatter yourself with the word partners. I was placed in the finance department by Chairman Thorne years ago to monitor your corruption and gather definitive evidence. Not a single cent of the money you thought you embezzled over the last few years has ever been under your control. The offshore balances you thought you were looking at were nothing more than a dummy interface I created. The man who had mercilessly deceived and discarded the weak had been thoroughly played by the accomplice he trusted most. The evil empire he thought he had built was, from the very beginning, a phantom sandcastle constructed in the palm of my father's hand. The final destination for a man who layers betrayal upon betrayal is a lonely hell where he can trust absolutely no one. Dad later admitted he felt a cold admiration at the cruel, perfect poetry of it. Caldwell's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the floor. The perfect forged documents, the camouflage of the prosecutor's sister, the massive escape funds, every single weapon he thought protected him, had been smashed to atoms. Wealth, prestige, escape routes. He had absolutely nothing left. Seeing this, the junior associates finally realized their own futures were completely obliterated. They covered their faces and broke down sobbing. Once the police and the feds hauled them away, the disease-infesting Pinnacle Global Holdings would finally be purged. It was over. Dad finally relaxed his shoulders, ready to let out a long, heavy sigh. But in the very next second, Caldwell, who had been crawling on the floor, suddenly let out a low, animalistic growl. He pulled a second smartphone from his jacket. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, glowing with a mad light that had completely lost all human reason. Fine. I lose. But Silas, I don't think I'm going to hell alone. Caldwell's trembling fingers tapped the screen. He twisted his face, pulling the corners of his mouth up into a ghastly grin. I'm a very cautious man. After I threw your daughter out this morning, I had my private investigators pull your home address just in case, and I sent a few guys from the underworld to pay a visit. He said the blood in his entire body turned to ice in a fraction of a second. The police officers around them surged forward to tackle Caldwell, but he didn't care, screaming his madness. Right about now, the guys I hired should be arriving at your house, where your arrogant little bitch is crying all by herself. Let's see how you celebrate taking back your company when the most precious thing in your life is destroyed. She's probably exhausted and sleeping right now. Did she lock the windows? Does she have a panic button? Too bad. The worst possible scenarios flashed through his mind, and his heart hammered an aggressive warning in his chest. While the officers pinned Caldwell to the floor, Dad pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and called me. The sterile ringing tone echoed endlessly. He thought I wasn't picking up, and a kind of cold sweat he had never experienced in his life trickled down his spine. Ah ha 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 ha! Too late. She's probably screaming right now. Caldwell raved from the floor. Dad later told me he feared he had been so consumed with purifying this massive corporation that he took his eyes off the one thing he needed to protect most. The bottomless helplessness he felt 15 years ago when he couldn't save my mom grabbed his heart like a cold fist. No matter how impenetrable a fortress of money and power you build, if you can't protect your one beloved family member, it's all just a pile of rubble. The agonizing fear that he had committed the ultimate failure as a parent nearly made his vision go black. Back at the townhouse, I was deeply asleep, but the line connected with a small electronic beep. Alara, are you safe? Where are you? Dad shouted over the speakerphone in the lobby, practically pleading. But the voice that came through the speaker wasn't my fragile voice. It was the calm, steel-hard voice of a man I knew well, who was standing guard in our hallway. Chairman Thorne, please be at ease. Miss Alara is sleeping soundly in the back room, and the house is fully secured. The moment Dad heard that voice, all the tension left his body, and he nearly dropped to his knees on the marble floor. The voice belonged to Gideon Cross, his former personal bodyguard and currently the CEO of the country's largest private military and security firm, Gideon. Thank God. What about the thugs Caldwell sent? Dad switched the phone to speaker, and Gideon's dependable voice echoed across the lobby. If you mean the 3 street-level amateurs that petty criminal Caldwell hired, my operatives neutralized and zip-tied them before they even set foot on your property line. We've already handed them over to the NYPD. At that report, the last, desperate, twisted smile completely vanished from Caldwell's face. Villains always foolishly believe, without any basis, that their cowardly traps will succeed perfectly. Their shallow minds can never comprehend that there are people who exist with conviction and meticulous preparation that vastly exceed their own. Dad let out a long, deep breath and turned a freezing gaze down to Caldwell on the floor. Caldwell, did you honestly think I would carelessly leave my deeply traumatized daughter alone in the house without taking precautions? For 15 years, my sole reason for living has been protecting Alara. The shallow tricks a rat like you could think up were countered ages ago. Caldwell lost his words, only able to open and close his mouth like a fish. No matter what cowardly tactic he used, he had been completely read and checkmated in advance. He thought he was being clever, but all he did was add more charges to his rap sheet, tightening the noose around his own neck. The despair of realizing his own stupidity must have been profound. Reaping what you sow was too mild a phrase. This was the picture of total, absolute defeat. Excellent coordination. Chairman Thorne. Agent Vance nodded quietly, signaling his agents to fully secure Caldwell in cuffs. My safety was guaranteed, and all of Caldwell's escape routes were sealed. Finally, this long war was over. But just as Dad thought that, Gideon spoke up from the phone, lowering his voice slightly to say something unexpected. Chairman, there is one more highly disturbing matter I need to report. What is it? Is there more? One of the thugs we caught started singing after a little. Aggressive interrogation. It seems the exorbitant bounty Caldwell promised them wasn't just for attacking your daughter, Dad asked, his voice tightening. After they attacked Miss Alara, they were ordered to head to another address and burn the house down with the family inside. To permanently silence another key witness who knows the full extent of Caldwell's crimes, the moment those words echoed in the lobby, CEO Julian Sterling, who had been standing in a daze, suddenly let out a horrific scream. He grabbed his head and collapsed to the floor, trembling violently, his eyes completely bloodshot and manic. Julian lunged at the pinned Caldwell. Even as the police officers pulled him back, Julian screamed in pure hysteria. Caldwell! You were going to burn my wife and kids alive? You were going to wipe out my family before I could talk to the feds? At Julian's scream, the junior associates covered their faces in horror. To protect his own neck, Caldwell was fully prepared to murder the family of the CEO who had helped him build his slush funds for years. This was the true nature of Caldwell's bottomless malice. The end result of relationships built purely on profit is the ugliest hell imaginable, where partners try to assassinate each other. With his arms twisted behind his back by the police, Caldwell just scoffed and looked away. You were going to betray me anyway. Silencing loose ends before it's too late is just business 101. Hearing those unapologetic words, Julian finally broke down, wailing on the floor. Gripping his phone, Dad looked down coldly at the pathetic state of his former right-hand man. He had deluded himself into thinking he was in a safe position while aiding and abetting evil. This was his rightful punishment. But the next words that flew out of Julian's mouth pried open the door to a new, shocking truth that betrayed the expectations of everyone in the room. I won't forgive you. I will never forgive you, Caldwell. If you're going to try and kill my family, I have my own cards to play. Julian turned to Dad, his face a mess of tears and snot, desperately reaching his hand out. Chairman Thorne, Agent Vance, listen to me. The real secret Caldwell is hiding isn't just embezzlement and slush funds. Julian, what are you saying? 15 years ago. Your wife, Genevieve. That illness. It wasn't a natural death. Caldwell set a terrifying trap regarding the new FDA drug development project. My mother's death was a trap? Those words froze the blood in Dad's veins. Everyone in the lobby gasped, the silence ringing in his ears. 15 years ago, my beloved mom collapsed from a severe, unexplained deterioration of her illness and never returned. He had cursed his own helplessness and devoted everything solely to raising me. Was he saying her death was calculated by someone's malice? What does that mean? Julian, explain it clearly. Dad's voice was so low and cold it felt like it was crawling across the floor. Clinging to the police officers, Julian continued his confession, his face erect. 15 years ago, Genevieve, she started investigating it on her own. To cover their tracks, Rothcroft, who was heading the biotech investment arm at the time, used his executive clearance to suppress the clinical trial data. And Caldwell, you acted as his dirty fixer. You facilitated the bribes to the hospital administrators to intentionally stall the FDA approval process, ensuring she couldn't receive the proper treatment in time. And after she died, Caldwell used that slush fund money to cement his current position as HR director. I knew about it, but to protect my own skin and the company's profits, I kept my mouth shut. He later told me that the more he learned the truth, the more his own foolishness cut into his soul. He thought he had stepped away from the company to protect our family, to secure a peaceful life for me. But in the darkness he had turned away from, my mother had fought alone against a massive evil, and her life was stolen. The 15 years he thought were peaceful were nothing but an illusion built on her noble sacrifice. The realization that his decision to protect us had ultimately driven the person he loved most to a lonely death gave him intense vertigo. Ah ha ha ha. What's wrong, Julian? Did the fear make you lose your mind? Pinned to the floor, Caldwell laughed, entirely misreading the room. Don't spout nonsense without evidence. She was just a busybody housewife. She poked her nose into corporate secrets where it didn't belong, and divine punishment struck her down. She should have just stayed home, cooked dinner, and waited for her husband. He laughed at Mom's noble sense of justice, calling it an annoying nuisance. The moment Dad heard those words, all emotion vanished from his face. He simply looked down at Caldwell in silence. The word anger was nowhere near sufficient. He didn't even feel the urge to raise his voice and curse him. His profound silence was the proof that he no longer recognized this man as human, but simply as a pestilence that needed to be eradicated from the earth. The junior associates, terrified by my father's unnatural stillness, huddled together, shivering. Caldwell, you son of a bitch! Keep my sister's name out of your filthy mouth. Agent Vance snapped, violently grabbing the lapels of Caldwell's designer suit and hoisting him up. The top federal agent, whose job was to hunt national corruption with cold precision, was now exposing his raw fury as a grieving brother. I've suspected for years her death was unnatural, but all the medical records from that time were suspiciously destroyed, and the people involved vanished. You were the one pulling the strings. Despite being choked by Uncle Vance, Caldwell maintained his creepy smirk. Like I said, where's the proof? The chief of that hospital and the project leads are all dead and gone. You can bust me for embezzlement, but you'll never pin a murder on me. I'll hire the best defense lawyers in the country, get out of federal prison in a few years, and live the rest of my life sipping cocktails on a beach. It was the most despicable escape clause of a villain who intimately knew the limits of the law. No matter how much evil you commit, if you destroy the evidence, the law cannot judge you. The face of this man, triumphantly exploiting the massive flaws of modern society, was repulsive enough to make Dad want to vomit. No evidence? Dad opened his mouth quietly, gently placing a hand on Vance's arm to make him release Caldwell. Caldwell, you really are a pathetic man who only believes in the world that is convenient for you. The moment he said that, the heavy automatic doors of the entrance opened once again. Standing there was Gideon Cross, the security PMC head who had just called to report my safety. But Gideon wasn't alone. Next to him, sitting quietly and staring straight ahead, was a white-haired old man in a wheelchair. The moment Caldwell saw the old man's face, the blood completely vanished from his own, and he let out a shriek as if he'd seen a ghost, trying to scramble backward. Impossible. You supposedly died in an accident overseas 10 years ago. Dad bowed deeply toward the old man in the wheelchair. Thank you for surviving and coming back to us, Dr. Mercer. He was the chief medical officer of the biotech project from 15 years ago, and my mother's primary physician. The old man slowly lifted a worn leather briefcase from his lap. The phantom from the past, whom Caldwell thought he had perfectly erased, had appeared right in front of him, carrying the definitive evidence to overturn everything. Caldwell's arrogant belief that he could crush anything with money and power was about to be shattered completely and eternally. The blade of truth that had crossed 15 years of time was now pressed deep into Caldwell's throat. You look like you've seen a ghost crawling up from the bottom of hell, Mr. Caldwell. Dr. Mercer's quiet voice echoed in the frozen lobby. 10 years of grueling life on the run had withered the once stout doctor to skin and bones, but the sharp light in his eyes, fixated on the truth, hadn't changed a bit. Caldwell, still sprawling on the floor, screamed, his facial muscles twitching hideously. Bullshit! 10 years ago, the car you were riding in through the Andes went off a cliff and burned to a crisp. I got the report that you were definitively dead. It is true that the hitmen you sent ran my car off a cliff, but by some miracle it got caught on a massive tree, and local villagers saved me. Dr. Mercer continued in an emotionless but heavy voice. Evil always overestimates the perfection of its plans and undervalues human life. But the human will to live, and the obsession with pursuing justice, can easily override the meticulous calculations of villains. A man who plays with other people's lives using money from a safe distance will never understand that kind of strength. The doctor turned to Dad. Fearing for my family's safety, I chose to play dead, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the day I could strike back. Chairman Thorne. I am so sorry to have kept you waiting. Doctor. Mercer bowed his head deeply to my father. Dad simply placed his hand gently on his thin shoulder in silence. There was no need for words. No language could adequately express his gratitude to this man who endured 15 years of unimaginable isolation, solely to expose the truth. Caldwell turned bright red, thrashing like a caterpillar in the grips of the federal agents. So what if you're alive? No matter what lies you spin, all the medical data from back then was wiped. The evidence of the slush funds, too. There's no proof anywhere. In response to Caldwell's pathetic bluff, Dr. Mercer slowly opened the thick briefcase on his lap. What you erased was the digital data on the hospital's servers. Just in case, I kept the original hard copies of the true clinical trial data for the new drug, as well as the documentary evidence of the slush funds that Genevieve had gathered independently. I took them with me into hiding. From Dr. Mercer's trembling hands, a thick stack of brownish, discolored documents was produced. The moment he saw it, Caldwell made a strange wheezing sound from the back of his throat and fell into pure despair. He was a man who used to casually cut down the lives of brilliant young people with a single piece of HR paper. Now, his own social life was about to be completely severed by old pieces of paper he firmly believed he had destroyed. The poetic justice was brilliant. Dr. Paranai, Iniwana 7, Lydia's. Mercer handed the stack of documents to Agent Vance. As Vance took them, Dad could see his arms trembling slightly with rage. It's my sister's handwriting. There's no mistake. The flow of the project's illicit funds is recorded in excruciating detail. Vance devoured the documents with his eyes. And here, the original clinical data for the drug that should have been FDA approved. Caldwell, you intentionally delayed the approval of the silver bullet drug that would have cured my sister for years. To hide your own fraud, you stole the hope of living from a single woman. Vance's furious voice sliced sharply through the air. Caldwell twisted his face, shaking his head frantically. No, I just put the approval paperwork on hold for a bit. She died of her illness. It's not like I killed her with my own hands. You can't charge me with murder. Now that his crimes were exposed, he desperately began spouting legal technicalities to escape the ultimate responsibility. The true nature of a cornered man is endlessly shallow and unsightly. Dad walked quietly up to Caldwell and looked down at him with an icy stare. Is that really true, Caldwell? At his low, echoing voice, Caldwell's shoulders flinched violently. It might be difficult to prove direct murder just because you delayed the drug approval. But at that time, my wife's condition rapidly and violently deteriorated far faster than the natural progression of the disease. When Dad said that, Dr. Mercer nodded quietly and pulled an even smaller plastic case from the bottom of his bag. Chairman Thorne is correct. Genevieve's sudden downturn was by no means due to the illness. Caldwell, you panicked. At Dr. Mercer's words, the color of Caldwell's face went from an ashen gray to pure white. Realizing that Genevieve was still trying to contact her brother at the DOJ even from her hospital bed, using the evidence she had, you couldn't wait for her to die naturally. So you forced the issue, didn't you? What bullshit is this? Where is the proof? Caldwell screamed, his voice cracking. The moment he did, Dr. Mercer opened the plastic case and pulled out a single, old microcassette tape. Genevieve sensed that her life was in immediate danger. So, she hid this small recorder taped to the underside of her hospital bed. The voice and footsteps of the person who snuck into her room the night before she died and injected a muscle relaxant into her IV. It's all recorded right here. Absolute silence fell over the marble lobby. Caldwell's eyes were open to their absolute limit, silent screams leaking continuously from his mouth, tampering with an IV line with lethal drugs. That was no longer indirect manslaughter. It was premeditated, first-degree murder with explicit intent to kill. With the very same filthy hands that tore my suit and mocked my family, this man had directly stolen my mother's life 15 years ago. An intense rage, as if all the blood in his body was flowing backward, surged up, but Dad bit his lip and desperately held it in. Because the next words Dr. Mercer spoke plunged not only Caldwell but everyone in the room into an even deeper abyss of shock. Caldwell, this tape also recorded your phone conversation with someone while you were tampering with the IV. You were just a mid-level manager back then, the true mastermind, the one who ordered the murder and guaranteed your subsequent promotion. His voice is on this tape. Dad told me he couldn't believe his ears. Caldwell hadn't planned the crime alone? Dr. Mercer set the tape into a playback device and quietly pressed the button. Through the static, Caldwell's panicked voice from 15 years ago, and the cold, ruthless voice of another man on the other end of the line, echoed through the lobby. Hearing that voice, CEO Julian Sterling rolled his eyes back into his head, started foaming at the mouth, and collapsed unconscious. That woman snooped around too much. Finish it tonight. Make it look like a natural complication. Do it right, and I'll pull you up into the inner circle of HR. That low, ruthless voice coming through the static pierced my father's eardrums and froze him to the marrow of his brain. Julian, foaming on the floor, mumbled the name like a delirious nightmare. Alistair. Supreme Advisor Rothcroft. It can't be. Mr. Rothcroft. The moment Dad heard that name, his vision nearly tinted red with fury. Alistair Rothcroft. 15 years ago, he was Dad's right-hand man, the executive vice president who helped him build this company. He later recounted how the image of Alistair at my mother's funeral flashed vividly in his mind. Alistair had hugged him tightly, telling him warmly, "Leave the company to us. Please, just focus on raising your daughter right." Every single one of those words full of kindness had been uttered from a mouth stained with my mom's blood. The devil wearing a human face had put on the mask of a saint and stood right beside him. While pretending to share in his ultimate grief, he was secretly laughing in his heart at the success of his perfect crime. The horrific contrast made a violent wave of nausea rise in him. Simply trusting people and living honestly is not enough to protect the ones you love. To realize this cruel truth, he had paid the price of 15 long years and the irreversible sacrifice of his wife's life. He gritted his teeth and dug his nails into his palms until they bled. I could only imagine the violent storm of emotion raging inside him, but not a single word came out of his mouth. When anger surpasses human comprehension, a person simply falls into a profound silence. No, it's different. I couldn't disobey him. Pinned to the floor, Caldwell began screaming like a madman. If I defied Mr. Rothcroft, he would have killed me too. I just followed orders. Everything is Rothcroft's fault. I'm a victim here. Just minutes ago, he was bragging about achieving the perfect crime using a federal prosecutor's name. Now, he was desperately begging for his life, trying to push all the blame onto someone else. Stripped of the halo of power, the sight of a villain is endlessly miserable and pathetic. The bonds of men who lined their pockets by sacrificing others vanish in an instant when they are backed into a corner. This is the pathetic end for those who choose the path of evil. Agent Vance looked down at Caldwell with cold eyes and jerked his chin at his subordinates. Save the pathetic excuses. You can spill it all in the interrogation room. HR Director Caldwell, you are under arrest for murder and corporate treason. Take him away. Held up by his armpits by the agents, Caldwell was dragged out of the lobby, weeping and screaming. CEO Sterling, still in a catatonic state, was also hauled away by other agents. After they were gone, a heavy, cold silence remained in the marble lobby. The junior associates, who had been flattering them earlier, were huddled against the walls, shivering violently. They, too, finally understood just how terrifying the darkness of the organization they were complicit in truly was, and the irreversible sin they had committed. Chairman Thorne, thank you for gathering the definitive evidence to avenge my sister. Agent Vance bowed deeply to Dad and Dr. Mercer. With this, we can arrest Rothcroft. He's not just the supreme advisor of Pinnacle Global Holdings. He's a heavyweight in the financial sector with deep ties to the political world. But with this audio data and Dr. Mercer's documents, no political shield can save him. Dad nodded quietly at Vance's words. But his war didn't end here. He could never just leave it to the authorities and wait for the results from a safe place. The source of it all, the man who stole my mother's life and tried to mercilessly shred my future. He had to look him in the eye and end it himself. Agent Vance. Where is Rothcroft right now? At his low, vibrating voice, Vance shot him a sharp look. Just then, one of the junior associates shivering by the wall spoke up in a trembling, mosquito-like voice. Supreme Advisor Rothcroft is on the top floor of this building. Dad turned slowly and stared at the associate. In the executive auditorium on the penthouse level, the final session of the elite analyst onboarding is happening today. Chairman of the board Rothcroft is delivering the closing address on corporate integrity to the new cohort right now. The moment he heard that, the cold flame in the depths of his heart roared to life. A keynote address for the new hires? They tore the clothes and trampled the dignity of one new hire, throwing her out onto the street, and the murderer who orchestrated it all was currently standing in front of young people brimming with hope, preaching grandly about corporate ethics and social contribution? Could there be a greater blasphemy? Agent Vance. I'm going up. When Dad said that shortly, Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then nodded deeply. Understood. I will deploy a tactical team to the top floor immediately. But Chairman Thorne, please, don't push yourself too far. Wordlessly, Dad turned his back and walked toward the private executive elevator at the back of the atrium. The old suit that had slept in his closet for 15 years was now wrapping his body with a definitive weight. The elevator doors closed silently and began a rapid ascent to the top floor. In the enclosed space, he closed his eyes, telling me later that he burned the image of my mother's gentle smile and my tearful breakdown this morning into his brain. Arriving at the top floor, the elevator doors opened. Before him towered the massive double doors of the executive auditorium, where the final session of the onboarding was taking place. Through the thick wood, Alistair Rothcroft's confident, amplified voice leaked out. What Pinnacle Global Holdings values above all else is the sanctity of human life and a high standard of ethics. From today onward, as proud members contributing to society, the moment Dad heard those hypocritical, deceitful words, he pushed the massive doors open with both hands without a shred of hesitation. Let's bring the curtain down on this devil's banquet. The heavy wooden doors groaned like the earth shifting, opening wide to the left and right. The ballroom, bathed in the light of dazzling chandeliers, was filled with the enthusiastic energy of hundreds of new hires. But the moment my father appeared, the air in the room froze instantly. Standing on the center stage, gripping the microphone and preaching his arrogance, Chairman of the board Rothcroft looked down at him, his eyes wide. The face of the man who had cried louder than anyone at my mother's funeral 15 years ago was now draped in an astronomically expensive suit, ruling as the absolute dictator of this company. Dad didn't let his expression slip, slowly walking down the red carpet of the center aisle, one step at a time. Oh, if it isn't Chairman Thorne! Rothcroft quickly hid his surprise, projecting an exaggeratedly warm voice through the PA system to the entire hall. New associates, let's give him a round of applause. The great founder of Pinnacle Global Holdings, Chairman Silas Thorne. My goodness, I heard you weren't feeling well today, but to think you'd rush over just for these young people. The new hires, knowing nothing, began to clap politely, albeit confused. Rothcroft wore the smile of a compassionate saint, but his eyes were as cold as a reptile's, glinting sharply as he tried to gauge my father's true intentions. Dad walked silently through the applause and stopped right below the stage. Due to his unnatural stillness and the intense aura radiating from his outdated suit, the applause gradually died down, eventually turning into complete silence. Chairman? Is something wrong? Perhaps you felt the urge to bask in the memories of the old days? Rothcroft addressed the crowd. Everyone, Chairman Thorne has been a bit exhausted lately, you see. Sometimes the line between past glory and reality becomes a bit blurry for him. He was treating Dad like a pathetic, senile old man, trying to thoroughly humiliate him in front of an audience. Elevating himself by degrading others, this was the paper-thin true nature of the man, unchanged in 15 years. Dad didn't utter a single word in response to his vile provocation. He later told me he was just ruminating in his head on the intense irony of the word ethics that this man threw around so casually. A man who stained his own hands with blood, who murdered his best friend's wife, standing before hopeful youth, preaching justice and morals. He realized profoundly that the true hell of this world exists in beautifully decorated places exactly like this. Devils never appear with terrifying horns. They wear the face of the most trustworthy saint, smiling at you from the safest possible place. Now, Chairman, this is a sacred space for the bright youth of our future. You seem tired, so let's have you rest in the back. Security, please escort the chairman to the VIP lounge. Rothcroft waved his hand dismissively, and burly security guards stationed along the walls began walking toward Dad. Rothcroft's face was plastered with the smirk of absolute victory. He assumed that even if Dad screamed about his crimes here, no one would believe the ramblings of an old man. A sacred space for the bright youth of our future? Here, for the first time, Dad broke the silence of the hall with a low, resonating voice. Rothcroft, for you to speak of the future or ethics with that mouth makes me violently sick to my stomach. At his clear, hostility-laced words, a murmur rippled through the new hires. Rothcroft's eyebrow twitched, and his ruthless true nature peeked out slightly from under his mask of smiles. Chairman, even for you, there is a line between what is acceptable to say and what is not. If you continue this unsightly display, we will have to remove you by force. The only thing unsightly here is you, Alistair. I think it's time everyone in this room hears exactly what you ordered behind the scenes 15 years ago. Dad raised his right hand high in the air. Immediately, the glass windows of the AV control booth at the back of the hall slid open from the inside. Standing there were Agent Vance's federal agents, who had already secured the booth. In the next second, the static-laced audio recording blasted from the massive stage speakers at maximum volume, echoing through the entire ballroom. That woman snooped around too much. Finish it tonight. Make it look like a natural complication. Do it right, and I'll pull you up into the inner circle of HR. The moment his own cold-blooded voice from his younger days was exposed in front of hundreds of people, all the blood literally drained from Rothcroft's face. The microphone slipped from his hand, hitting the floor with a deafening screech. The ballroom erupted into chaos and panic, the raw, undeniable evidence of a murder conspiracy. The new hires, realizing it was the voice of the supreme advisor they were supposed to respect, recoiled in sheer terror. The past sins he thought he had perfectly concealed were exposed on his most glorious stage, in the most brutal way possible. This was Dad's counterattack, packed with 15 years of pure rage. You bastard, where did you get that audio? Rothcroft leaned on the podium, panting heavily, glaring down at him. Dr. Mercer is alive. And Caldwell has confessed to everything. About your orders to inject the muscle relaxant into my wife's fore, and the full extent of the embezzlement that followed. Caldwell and Julian are already in federal custody. Hearing those words, Rothcroft should have been pushed to the absolute edge of despair. But villains truly die hard. Rothcroft didn't panic. Instead, his lips curled into a chilling, condescending sneer. He straightened his tie with eerie calm. I see you've done your homework, Silas. Impressive for a retired ghost. But so what? Rothcroft looked down at Dad, his eyes cold and devoid of remorse. I killed her. That's right. I got rid of that annoying bitch. While you were running away to play house, I was the one pulling the strings in the shadows to make this company massive. I have the right to rule this empire. At Rothcroft finally admitting to murder from his own mouth, another scream rose from the new hires. But you can't arrest me. Never. Over the last 15 years, I've scattered millions in dark money to the top brass of the NYPD and the heavyweights in Washington. To them, I am an unbreakable vault of cash they can't afford to lose. If the DOJ tries to make a move, pressure from the top will shut the investigation down instantly. You lose, Silas. Convinced of his victory, Rothcroft let out a hideous cackle. As long as he had money and power, he could cover up any crime. That was the absolute truth he believed in. Now, somebody throw this senile old fool out. Anyone who defies me won't just be fired. I'll make sure you can't find a job anywhere in the United States. Rothcroft screamed. It was exactly at that moment. The massive doors of the ballroom opened again, and heavy footsteps echoed in the room. The man who walked in was Senator Orson Graves, a political heavyweight and the Don of Washington, whom Rothcroft considered his ultimate lifeline. Rothcroft's face lit up instantly. He looked like he'd seen the Messiah. "Senator Graves! Perfect timing! This crazy old man is trying to frame me. Please use your influence to silence the feds immediately." But Senator Graves, walking slowly into the room, didn't even look at Rothcroft. He walked straight up to my father, and in front of hundreds of people, bowed his head to him with absolute, profound respect. "Chairman Thorne, as you instructed, I have handed over the entire list of illegal campaign contributions and the shadow ledger data I received from Rothcroft directly to the DOJ. Will this lessen my sentence, even a little?" The moment those words echoed through the hall, all human expression completely vanished from Rothcroft's face. "Senator Graves? You're joking, right?" A pathetic wheeze squeaked out of Rothcroft's throat. The political Don, who supposedly held absolute power, was bowing deeply to my dad, a retired older man. Faced with this unbelievable sight, Rothcroft's brain entirely lost its ability to process reality. The mask cracked and fell from his face. He grabbed the sleeve of Senator Graves' luxury suit with trembling hands, begging desperately, "Senator, do you know how much dark money I've funneled into your PACs? Are you really going to abandon me? Call the DOJ and get this crazy old man out of here." Graves shot Rothcroft a look of extreme coldness, then forcefully swatted his hand away as if brushing off a filthy insect. "Don't misunderstand, Rothcroft. What I associated with wasn't your money. It was the glittering brand of Pinnacle Global Holdings and the ironclad social trust Chairman Thorne spent decades building. You, who operated in the shadows like a termite rotting the foundation, are of no value to me anymore. Loyalty bought with power turns to dust in an instant before an even greater power. The man who callously cut down others for his own benefit was now effortlessly cut down by the power he relied on most. The bonds of villains are nothing more than a castle of sand, vanishing the moment their own self-preservation is threatened. The sight of this man, who had sat back arrogantly behind the shield of massive power, now groveling miserably before a more massive truth, was exactly that comical. Dad simply looked down coldly at the pathetic sight of the villain plummeting to the earth. His final lifeline completely severed, Rothcroft finally dropped to both knees on the red carpet, and this time, he crawled pathetically toward Dad. "Silas. No, forgive me. It was all my fault. I'll give the company entirely back to you. I'll give you all my personal assets, the money in the hidden accounts, everything. Just please, don't let the feds arrest me. I'm begging you. For old time's sake." His face a mess of tears and mucus. Dragging his expensive suit across the floor, he desperately clung to my father's leather shoes. 15 years ago, the very same warm hands that had hugged Dad at my mother's funeral were now frantically scrambling at his feet in a pathetic plea for his life. The tears of the friend who shared his sorrow back then were the tears of joy from a devil who had achieved the perfect crime. Without a shred of emotion, Dad quietly kicked away Rothcroft's hands as they tried to grab his shoes. "Old time's sake? Alistair, do you truly believe the depth of the sin you committed stealing my wife's life and trampling on Alara's future can be bought off with your filthy money and status?" Dad's voice, at absolute zero, rang out in the dead-silent ballroom. A blade of silence far sharper than any scream completely shredded whatever tiny fraction of pride Rothcroft had left. Refusing to face the weight of his own crimes and trying to solve it with money to the very end, this spiritual poverty was the definitive proof that he was entirely bankrupt as a human being. From the back of the hall, dozens of federal agents, led by Agent Vance, flooded in, their heavy boots thundering. The elite tactical unit completely surrounded the cornered Rothcroft. "Alistair Rothcroft, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, corporate embezzlement, and violation of federal campaign finance laws. We'll hear the rest of your truths in the interrogation room." Along with Uncle Vance's earth-shaking declaration, the cold steel handcuffs clicked ruthlessly shut around Rothcroft's wrists. Under the dazzling light of the ballroom chandeliers, the dull gleam of the handcuffs looked dreadfully vivid. "Stop! Let go of me! I'm not a man who ends in a place like this. I am the god of this company. I made this empire what it is." Even in cuffs, Rothcroft writhed hideously and screamed. But there was not a single person in this vast room willing to help him. The new hires stared silently, with eyes full of a mixture of terror and disgust, as the man who was just preaching ethics on stage was dragged away like a piece of garbage. The end of a man decorated with false authority was a lonely, pathetic exit that no one would ever look back on. When evil perishes, there is not a single shred of dramatic beauty to it. It only leaves behind a profound disgust and a cold aftertaste. As Rothcroft's screams faded outside the hall and the heavy doors closed, a heavy silence descended on the room once again. Dad turned around slowly and surveyed the hundreds of new hires standing frozen before the stage. They were all pale with anxiety, faced with the reality that the company they had just joined was rotten to the core, wondering what would happen to them now. Without using a microphone, he let his raw voice echo through the hall. I deeply apologize, as the founder, for tainting your glorious first day with such a horrific display. When he bowed deeply, a small murmur and a wave of confusion spread through the crowd. Today, a young woman was supposed to take her first steps as a working adult in this very company. But she was mocked, her suit was torn, and she was thrown out into the street, all for the irrational reason that she was raised by a single parent. The root of that malice was none other than Pinnacle Global Holdings. A look of shock and pain appeared on the faces of the new hires. They too must have felt the fear of being forced to obey unreasonable orders as cogs in a machine. But I want you to remember this. The organization you work for does not define your humanity. It is the righteous, ethical compass of each and every one of you that will guide this company to what it should be. Never yield to unreasonable malice. Have the courage to speak up when something is wrong. That is your first duty as working adults, having witnessed the tragedy today. At his words, the tense air suddenly softened, and he saw tears rolling down the cheeks of several new hires. The rot at the top had been excised. From here on, this company had to be reborn into a completely new organization by the hands of this younger generation. With this, all the dirty work he had to do was finished. He later described feeling the heavy burden of 15 years finally melt away as a quiet breeze blew through his heart. My father's smartphone vibrated in his breast pocket. He looked at the screen. It was an incoming call from me. The situation was completely resolved, and the thugs Caldwell sent had already been handed over to the police. Feeling a sliver of anxiety despite the situation being resolved, he quickly pressed the answer button. Alara, what's wrong? I thought you were resting at home. When he asked, the voice that came through the phone was entirely different from the tearful, trembling voice from this morning. It was unexpectedly strong, filled with absolute resolve. Dad, I'm in the lobby of the headquarters right now. There's something I absolutely have to finish with my own two hands. Can I come up? The moment he heard those words, the massive double doors of the ballroom began to open slowly from the outside. Everyone's eyes instantly snapped toward the opening doors. I stood there, flanked by several burly bodyguards. Beyond the heavy wooden doors stood me, his beloved daughter. My tear-stained, terrified figure from this morning was gone. The eyes looking straight ahead held the exact same fierce strength that my late mother had when she faced down a massive evil all by herself. I walked slowly down the red carpet toward Dad, protected by the bodyguards. Clutched tightly in my hands was the brand new navy blue blazer that had been torn this morning. Alara, why are you here? I told you to rest at home, he rushed over in surprise. I shook my head, looking back at him with a dignified expression. I was tired of hiding in a safe place, crying, while my dignity was trampled on. You were fighting so hard for me, Dad. I couldn't be the only one running away. I stood next to him and bowed quietly to the new hires filling the hall. Everyone, I'm sorry to surprise you with my sudden visit. This morning, in this very building, my blazer was torn, I was mocked, and I was thrown out because I was raised by a single father. My clear voice echoed firmly into every corner of the hall, even without a microphone. At that moment, I felt like my entire life was over. I was called the bottom feeder of society, and the world went totally dark with despair. But I know clearly now, the only thing they tore was a piece of fabric. They never managed to tear my heart or my pride. The adults who wore expensive suits and flaunted absolute social status had stained their hands with ugly crimes in the shadows. And in the end, they crawled pathetically on the ground, begging for their lives. Everyone in this room had just witnessed the cruel contrast between outward beauty and internal rot. My unadorned words pierced straight into the hearts of the new hires, far deeper than any grand speech Rothcroft had given. They listened to me intently, with serious expressions. I turned back to Dad, and this time, I showed a soft, genuine smile. Thank you, Dad, for fighting such a hard battle to protect me. He shook his head. No, I only did what any parent would do. I am so sorry you had to go through such pain. Then, I clasped both his hands tightly, my eyes filling with tears. Dad, I have never, not once in my entire life, thought I was pitiable just because I only had one parent. You always gave me double the love, and you taught me all about Mom's noble sense of justice. I am the luckiest daughter in the whole world. The moment he heard those words, 15 years' worth of heavy tears broke the dam and poured from his eyes. He later confessed to me that he had always thought he needed to protect me from all malice, raising me in a greenhouse. But the love a parent pours into a child doesn't just make them a fragile flower. It makes them grow fierce, resilient roots that won't yield to any storm. He saw that even without him acting as my shield, I was already standing firmly on my own 2 feet, possessing the strength to deflect malice. He told me later that when he realized that his 15 years of loneliness and regret were completely rewarded, melting away like snow in the spring. A few days later, the unprecedented scandal surrounding Pinnacle Global Holdings was broadcast heavily on the news day after day. Rothcroft, Caldwell, and Sterling were subjected to intense federal interrogation, and it was certain they would face extremely heavy federal prison sentences for a multitude of crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder and embezzlement. The dirty assets they had amassed out of greed were all seized and used to cover the funds stolen from the company. The men who had clung to power and money, looking down on others, were now tasting the hell they feared most. The complete loss of their status and prestige, sitting behind cold iron bars. Those who sacrifice others for their own self-preservation end up abandoned by everyone, losing everything. This was the most fitting conclusion for villains. Dad temporarily returned to the position of chairman. With the trusted help of Dr. Mercer and Agent Vance, we began a drastic root and branch reform of the organization. And the new hires who were in the ballroom that day, not a single one of them quit the company. The young people who learned the true nature of unreasonable malice and witnessed the courage to stand up against it would become the true assets of this reborn corporation. A pleasant spring breeze blew through the elevated cemetery. Dad and I stood there. He gently laid a bouquet of white lilies, my mom's favorite flower, in front of the polished marble headstone. Genevieve, it took a little time. But it's all over now. He spoke quietly. Beside him, I gently rested my hand on the polished marble headstone, closing my eyes with a soft smile. Mom, I'm going to work really hard at my new job. I had been welcomed as a new hire at a different, highly ethical corporation Dad had found. This time, no one would mock my upbringing. It was a warm workplace that would fairly evaluate me based solely on my abilities and my straightforward heart. Staring at the headstone, Dad looked at peace, basking in a deep, quiet resonance. Malice and unreasonableness certainly exist in this world. However, no matter how deep the darkness, it can never completely extinguish the light of a parent's unconditional love and the courage to stand by what is right. The light my mother protected with her life, and that my father spent 15 years nurturing, was now shining brilliantly in my heart. Dad gently wrapped his arm around my shoulders, and we looked quietly up at the clear, blue spring sky. In our lives going forward, there would be no more hesitation, and nothing left to fear.